Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be on one of the first surrogate wars of the Cold War, and that's going to be the war in Korea. So we have to talk a little bit about Korea and kind of the history of Korea. So Korea used to be a colony of Japan before World War II, and so the Japanese really brutalized the Koreans. They thought of them as like this inferior race, and just extracted resources from Korea in a pretty extremely brutal way. Um, but then once World War II happened, then the Americans are fighting the Japanese. The Soviets will provide some help as well, and so the two sides are fighting. And essentially, the Japanese are going to be defeated in Korea by both sides, the Soviets and the Americans. The Soviets were attacking the Korean peninsula from the top down, and the Americans were attacking the peninsula from the bottom up. And so the two essentially met in the middle. And so when the war ended, the Soviets were in charge of the northern half, and the Americans were in charge of the southern half. And so they both sides, neither side wanted to relinquish power. Remember, both sides want to spread their ideology across the world. And so the communists want to maintain control of North Korea because they want it to be a communist government, and the Americans want to maintain a sphere of influence, if not direct control, over the South because we want to spread democracy. And so the two sides decide to split the country and in the middle, which is the 38th parallel. That's an important demarcation to remember because it's going to indicate both the start and the finish of this war. So 38th parallel here is important. And then both sides essentially, decide that they're going to have elections. The northern half, under the communist influence, they're going to essentially rig their elections to make sure the communists win. In the South, we'll have, the Americans will influence the elections in the South, but it's not rigged. And both sides miraculously end up with governments of the same ideology as the country that's issuing or is exerting their influence. And so each side has elections. So it should surprise no one that North Korea ends up becoming communist and South Korea ends up becoming democratic. Now, to talk about what happens next, we really have to go back to talking about George Kennan and the X article, right? So we talked about that in a previous lecture. Kennan has essentially said that it's the Soviets' goal, and he's correct in this, that it's the Soviets' goal to spread communism worldwide. But the Soviets do respond to power, and so they will back down if confronted aggressively enough. But if they sense weakness, they're going to attempt to exert influence there, right? And so they'll attack weakness. Well, America makes a minor miscalculation here that's going to have real big consequences. So America, Korea is not the economic powerhouse that it is today. Back then it's just not, it's not really strategically important to America, except in regards to containment theory, right? We want it to stay democratic because that contains communist North Korea to its boundaries. And so that's the only real importance of South Korea to America. The bigger, more important country in that area, as far as America is concerned, is Japan. And so America has a large military presence in Japan, right? We are rebuilding that country. MacArthur's there writing their constitution and helping to stabilize Japan. And so America will, after the South sets up their government, they're just going to keep 500 soldiers in South Korea. Well, the Soviets are going to view that as weakness, and so they think that, and this is where the Soviets miscalculate. The Americans miscalculate. They should have kept a larger force there. that would have deterred the Soviets. But the American logic was, well, we don't need to keep a bunch of soldiers there. We have a bunch in Japan. You can take a look at the map right there. There's Japan, and then there's Korea. They're very, very close. And so America's just like, we'll just keep a few troops there, and if we have to, we can pull people from Japan. Not realizing that the Soviets are going to sense weakness there and want to attack that weakness. The Soviets, their miscalculation is assuming that we don't care about South Korea at all because we only left 500 troops. That is totally a miscalculation because we believe in domino theory that if one country falls, its neighbors will. So if South Korea falls, then multiple other countries will fall too. And eventually it might get to a country that could do some economic damage to the United States. And so we have to stop it everywhere. So the Soviets miscalculate thinking that we won't do anything if the North Koreans attack South Korea. And so it's kind of laying the groundwork here. So we will see an outbreak of hostilities. The North Koreans will invade South Korea. It is a Soviet plan. So the Soviets essentially call up the North Koreans and say, hey, we think America is not going to do anything if you invade the South. So we will send you supplies. We will train your soldiers. We'll send advisors so you can learn from them. But you can invade on your own. And the Soviets even come up with the plan for the invasion. And the North Koreans are like, yeah, we'll take that. Good deal. And so about 75,000 North Korean troops get, pretty well equipped and pretty well trained. The same's not happening in the South. America's, we're not really equipping the South very well. The South Korean troops are definitely not trained very well. And so, when North Korea does invade, the North Koreans are going to have a tremendous amount of early success. The UN Security Council will eventually decide to step in and assist the South Koreans, and we'll talk a little bit more about. We'll just talk about it now. So the North Koreans attack the South, and the South just not very well defended. And the North captures Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea, and is able to actually push the South Korean troops and the 500 American troops all the way to the southernmost part of the country and a port city known as Busan. This is pretty dire. The Americans, they're going to fight bravely. The South Koreans will fight bravely as well. But they're just not, the South Korean troops just aren't trained well enough. The American troops are struggling. Americans haven't really figured out jungle warfare yet. And so we're struggling with that. Plus, the Americans are drinking the water in the rainforest there in the jungle. And so, our digestive tracts aren't set up for that. And so they get dysentery, diarrhea. And so, fighting with that is difficult. And so, not to make excuses, 500 troops couldn't stop 75,000 troops anyway. So it doesn't really matter. But they're struggling. They get pushed back to Busan. Now, Busan, on the borders of just outside of Busan, there's a river that's going to slow down the North Koreans and a series of hills that the Americans are just going to flood with artillery. And that's going to be able to hold off the North Korean troops. That's very important because Busan, if that falls, we lose our toehold into the Korean peninsula. And so as long as we hold Busan, reinforcements can come in through Busan, and we can essentially fight our way out of this terrible situation. So America is now in this tough spot. We are hesitant to want to go full on to war. We are kind of afraid that this is kind of a distraction from Europe, and so we don't want to. We're hesitant here. And so what Truman's going to do is he's going to try and use the UN, the United Nations, as this international governing body to do what its charter says it's supposed to do, which is to protect countries from other hostile countries. And so we're going to go to the United Nations and we're going to say we need to protect South Korea's sovereignty, right? They've been attacked by a hostile power. The United Nations is supposed to help stop that. Please do something about it. Well, This is really tricky because remember from previous lectures, the United Nations, the big countries, the big powers only got involved as long as they had veto power in the Security Council. And so that's Great Britain, France, America, Soviet Union, and China all have veto power here. And so if the Soviets planned this thing, although they're in public, they're saying we didn't have anything to do with it. This is all North Korea, but still, they did plan it. They want this to happen. There's no way that the Soviet Union would ever allow the Security Council to step in and stop it. They would just veto it, and they could do that pretty simply. But there's all kinds of other international political things going on. The Soviet Union is upset about the creation of Taiwan, right? The Soviet Union wants to spread communism everywhere. Well, Taiwan, that's where Shanghai Shek and the nationalist Chinese fled to Chinese Formosa, and turned it into the democratic state of Taiwan. And so, the Soviets believe that nope, that should be a part of China. It should be communist. And so, to protest that, they've actually walked out of the UN. And so they've said, whoa, this is ridiculous. Taiwan should be communist, and we're walking out. And so when they walked out, that's when America was like, hey, let's have a vote about this South Korea situation. All right, everybody ready? Okay, who thinks we should go help South Korea? All right, raise your hand. Okay, that's everybody. Sweet, done deal. And the United Nations Security Council will, in fact, vote to defend South Korea because the Soviets were protesting Taiwan. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, it means that we're going to get an international coalition, 16 different countries going to send over 500,000 troops to South Korea to defend South Korea. I mean, 90% American troops. So, I mean, America, let's be real here. This is mostly America fighting. But it's not just important because we're defending a country from being attacked by an aggressive country. It's also important because it just proved that the United Nations is not the League of Nations, right? The League of Nations failed because it had no teeth. It couldn't enforce it couldn't enforce its will anywhere. And so the United Nations passes a resolution that says you shouldn't attack an independent country, and now they're sending troops, which means the United Nations has teeth, which is going to make it a legitimate international governing body, and so that's important. So the Soviet Union, the USSR, is absent for the vote, and so the resolution will get passed, and General Douglas MacArthur will get put in charge of the forces there. That makes sense. Americans in charge. 90% of the 500, I think it's like 520,000 troops are going to be American. So MacArthur gets put in charge. That kind of makes sense. MacArthur had some success during World War II. I say some because remember, from previous lectures, he did not prepare the Philippines for invasion, even though he should have known that they were about to get invaded. So he loses the Philippines because of his mistake. He will famously say, I shall return. He does return. He's going to be able to, be successful, after that during World War II. And then he was very successful in governing Japan. And so, I'm pretty critical of MacArthur, and I'm going to be very critical of him today in this lecture. But we got to give him his due. He did some good things during World War II, so they're going to put him in charge here. His initial battle strategy during the Korean War is genius. It is genius. He's going to save South Korea. But then he makes some very serious mistakes. I mean, I think some of the biggest, potentially biggest military mistakes, in modern American history. I mean, he's going to get us this close to World War III and a nuclear war because of some of the mistakes he makes here. So, irregardless, irregardless is not a word. So, regardless, MacArthur is put in charge and is going to be tasked with liberating South Korea. And remember, South Korea stops at the 38th parallel. Again, that's going to be important. Russia has denied having anything to do with this. Clearly, they have. And now China is very concerned. China, think about it. First of all, what you got to realize is at the time, everybody in America thinks that Russia, the Soviet Union, is in charge of all communist nations, that they're all just doing the Soviet Union's bidding. That's not true, right? We talked in previous lectures about Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is communist, and they're doing their own thing. They are influenced by the Soviet Union, but it's not a puppet government. China's the same way. China and the Soviet Union are have fundamentally different views of what communism should be. The Russians, the Soviets believe that communism should be industrial. The Chinese believe it should be agricultural. And although we think of that today as like not a big deal, back then it really kind of was. And so Mao, who has taken over in China, he's not beholden to the Soviet Union, and dependent upon the Soviet Union. They're their own independent country, and they're looking at this and they're mad. They're actually mad because China wants a buffer zone of other communist nations around it for protection, so they don't get invaded by hostile forces, right? And so North Korea provides that for them. And now, because the Soviet Union meddled in Korea, there's 500,000 democratic capitalist troops right in China's backyard. And so China's like watching like a hawk, and they're like, that could be trouble for us. And Russia did that to us. And so it's the first kind of clue that there's tensions between these two communist powers. And China's kind of freaking out. And they're like, well, what's going on here? If these 500,000 troops, get a little bit too aggressive here, that could be consequential for us. And so China's watching the situation very, very closely. That will be impactful later. So the North Koreans, like I said, have a lot of success. They're going to sweep through Seoul very quickly, which is the capital of South Korea, and just massively quickly, and then I'll actually get to Busan very shortly thereafter. And so, like I said, all of that was created by with the aid of the Soviet Union. And the American and Soviet troops just aren't prepared for the massive push that the North Koreans have done here. And so American troops are surrounded at Busan. MacArthur is now put in charge, and he's got to figure out what to do. So, why do the Americans get involved? Well, one, we feel we feel sheltered here a little bit because the UN has backed this. America's not going to have to declare war here. It's just going to be a policing action. That'll set a trend for later. America doesn't really like to declare war anymore, because that requires some act of Congress. A policing action means that the president can essentially act on his own. And so this is done with the blessing of the UN, which means we don't have to declare war. It also legitimizes the UN, worldwide. So why does Truman want to get involved? Well, one, he feels like this is a Russian plan, which it is, and that we need to show the Russians that we're going to try and stop them wherever they try to expand. Again, that's a part of containment policy. If the Russians feel like we're going to step aside and let them have Korea, then maybe we'd step aside and let them have Vietnam, and then Cambodia, and then Laos, and then all of a sudden maybe the Philippines, and all of a sudden then we're getting into countries that are pretty strategically important for America. And so we have to step up and stop them as soon as possible. The other concern that Sherman has is appeasement. He learned the lessons from World War II. Neville Chamberlain and Great Britain tried to appease Hitler. They're like, we'll just give him what he wants. We want to avoid war. It doesn't really matter. What he wants now are kind of small potatoes. That's fine. We'll throw him a bone and then he'll be satisfied. Well, that just made Hitler more and more hungry and more aggressive. And so Truman doesn't want to do that. It's strict discipline here. Like, if I give you an inch, you'll take a mile. And so that's not going to be okay. And so he doesn't want to appease the Soviet Union. And again, the similar kind of concept here. He's afraid that if he does nothing here, that'll just encourage other revolutionary movements around the world. Ho Chi Minh is fighting in Vietnam. There are kind of rebel movements in Latin America and South America. That's our own backyard. We want to send a signal to all those revolutionaries out there that we will step in and protect democracies. And so this is just another example of that. And then, and this is a big reason too, McCarthyism at home. We'll do a whole lecture on McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy is really a no-name senator that makes a name for himself by, saying that the American government has been infiltrated by communists, and that it just causes this huge uproar. We'll go into detail about that later, but essentially it has made it politically impossible to seem soft on communism. And so any political official that does anything that looks like they're soft on communism, they're going to lose their job. And so Truman's got to not only protect himself, but he's got to protect other Democrats down ballot. And so to be able to do that, he's got to show that he and the Democratic Party are tough on communism. And so that's going to influence his decision to, go to the UN and get permission for this military. So Truman does have some concerns, however. One, he really thinks that this might be a diversion from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, Korea is a white spot in the road, and so it's not super strategically important for Russia, but Europe is. And so the fear is that the Soviet Union has, stirred the pot in Korea, not really committed any forces there, just some materials that are inconsequential to the Soviet Union. And then America is going to commit, close to 500,000 troops to that area. And then while we're busy over there in this, wide spot in the road, and I don't mean to be disparaging to South Korea. It's one of the most important economies in the world today. It's got a beautiful culture, beautiful people. But at the time, I mean, wide spot in the road in the sense that it's not strategically important to the United States. And so we commit all our troops over there. And then while our troops are busy over there, the Soviet Union then starts to expand in Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe. And so, Truman is very concerned about that. So once we commit troops to Korea, he's also going to commit more troops to Europe as well. So, essentially it's a checking mechanism like, hey, don't think we can't do two things at once. We're going to protect Korea, but we're also going to step up our presence in Europe so that we're watching, and effective. Right. He then also starts to step up his help to the French in Indochina. And so this is America essentially getting involved in Vietnam. Domino theory, right? North Korea is communist. South Korea is really under the threat of becoming communist. Then in the same region of the world, the French are fighting the communist forces, Ho Chi Minh's communist forces, and so that region looks like a hot spot for the spread of communism. And so we start to help the French, giving them money and supplies to fight off the Vietnamese. Eventually, the French are just going to be too exhausted, and too many resources are being spent, and they're going to have to pull out of Vietnam, just like the British pulled out of Greece, which is going to leave a power vacuum that they're going to expect America to step into. And so, when you're talking about the causes of the Vietnam War later, this is, kind of the, shouldn't say it's the first step, but it's the first real substantial step towards our war in Vietnam. So the American troops are surrounded at Busan. So at this time, MacArthur starts to flood troops in from Japan, and then later all around the world into the Busan region. The problem is they're surrounded, they're trapped. And so he's flooding troops in, and he's flooding troops in, and he starts to realize, if he just tries a head on attack, that's going to be, actually, can be pretty dangerous. The North Koreans are, like I said, well equipped, well trained. Even though our troops will be better equipped, it's still dangerous, and it could, cause a whole lot of casualties. And so MacArthur actually come up with a pretty genius plan, and it'll be to essentially have a run around the North Korean forces. And so he reinforces the troops trapped at Busan, and then decides, well, Korea's a peninsula. And because it's a peninsula, that means it's surrounded by water on three sides. We have a great navy. The North Koreans don't. And so, you know what we could do? we could put our troops on a boat, swing them around the peninsula, around the North Korean forces, land them at a port city called Incheon, which is very close to Seoul, right, which is the capital. And then if we can take Incheon and Seoul, we can then surround the 75,000 North Korean troops. Now, this is a genius move because one, it's very it's very smart to not attack your enemies head on, to surround them. It's kind of stolen from World War II, and Anzio, and going around the Gustav line in Italy. So it's not completely original, but it's genius because Incheon is one of those port cities it's not very well defended by the North Koreans, because nobody really thinks that you can land an entire army at the port of Incheon. But MacArthur figures it out logistically and swings around to Incheon at the same time as some troops kind of break through the flanks at Pusan, and essentially create a pincer movement that then will surround the 75,000 North Korean troops. So very risky because the Incheon could have been disastrous for us, logistically, even though it's not defended very well. But ends up being very successful. And it's at this point that the war should be over, right? The North Korean troops are surrounded, and the North Koreans don't have any significant number of troops left. They committed most of everything they had to this battle. And so the North Korean troops are pretty much out of it. And so we've recaptured Seoul, because Seoul is so close to Incheon, and there you go, we've got it. All we have to do is push to the 38th parallel, which is very close to Seoul, and the whole thing's over. We have successfully defended South Korea, which was the UN's mandate, and so that was all we were really supposed to do. But MacArthur senses an opportunity here. He knows the North Koreans are essentially defeated, and it would be a cakewalk to take North Korea. And so he's going to decide to invade North Korea and cross the 38th parallel. Truman will tell him not to do that, not because Truman doesn't want North Korea to be democratic. Of course he does. The problem is, though, that if you cross the 38th parallel, you're not worried about the North Koreans anymore. Now, all of a sudden, you're worried about the North Koreans' neighbor, China, right? And China is literally on the phone with the Truman administration saying, don't mess with North Korea. If you mess with North Korea, we might have to get involved, right? The Soviets are looking at it, and the Soviets might step in to defend North Korea as well, because they don't want to lose a communist nation. And so Truman tells MacArthur, don't do it. MacArthur pretends he doesn't get the message, the haze of war, and decides to press on past the 38th. And so American troops relatively easily cross the 38th parallel into North Korea, and then push all the way up to the northern border. At this point, the Chinese are freaking out. They're freaking out, and they're on the phone with the Truman administration saying, stay away from the Yalu River. So the northern border between North Korea and China is the Yalu River, and the Chinese are saying, stay away from it. Like, seriously, this is a non-starter. You have to stay away from that. If you push all the way to the border, then we are going to get involved. And Truman takes that real seriously. We're getting intelligence reports that there are Chinese soldiers amassing at the border. Now, we don't know that there's actually 300,000 Chinese soldiers at the border, but we know they're amassing troops there. And so Truman takes it seriously and is ordering MacArthur, stay away from the Yalu River. Well, MacArthur, again, ignores the direct order. Generals just can't do that. They have to listen to the president. I mean, that's the way our government is set up and the way our military is set up. MacArthur ignores it, essentially because he believes that China isn't much of a threat. They don't have a modern Air Force. Our Air Force is way superior, and they don't have nukes. And so he's like, that will deter the Chinese from attacking. The fact that we have nukes and can use them, and MacArthur will advocate for us to use nukes eventually in this war. So he believes that that'll act as a deterrent, and we can essentially do what we want here. And it is pretty clear that MacArthur also wants war with China. Right, he will be secretly meeting with Shanghai Shek and talking about reinstalling him in China. He believes if he can be the hero to save Korea and China, that will, put him in the history books forever. Eventually, he's going to run for president. Eventually, he's going to want to run for president eventually, and so he's sensing personal opportunity here, and so he will push all the way to and then across the Yalu River. Well, I mean, now we have a whole new ballgame. Now, all of a sudden, as soon as he crosses the Yalu River, 300,000 Chinese soldiers immediately enter the war. We are no longer fighting North Korea. We are fighting China now. And China literally is going to have millions of troops to be able to commit to this battle. So Truman orders MacArthur to stay away from the Yalu. China had warned him repeatedly, yet MacArthur eventually crosses the Yalu. Again, he believes that American nukes and Air Force will be a good enough of a deterrent. But the reality is, we're not going to use nukes in China, not because China has nukes to retaliate against, but there's no way the Soviet Union does, and there's no way the Soviet Union would let us nuke China, conquer China, and then take close to 1 billion communists off of the map, and so they can't have that, and so ultimately these deterrents aren't going to deter China because China knows that the Soviets would never allow them to be nuked without retaliation, and so MacArthur crosses the Yalu, and all of a sudden now we are going to be fighting the Chinese. Once China enters the war, completely different game. They start to push MacArthur back, and eventually we get pushed back past the 38th parallel again. So now, again, told you the 38th is important. We're back into South Korean territory. Seoul will fall again. And it's at this point that MacArthur is advocating for the use of nuclear weapons, again, which would probably start World War III. Most military experts think that this is, a bad idea, dropping nukes, but MacArthur's advocating for them. He's going behind the president's back, meeting with congressmen, saying that he could win this thing if Truman just wouldn't get in the way. He's writing newspaper articles undermining Truman. I mean, all of this stuff is just not acceptable for a sitting general to be doing. And so, ultimately, like I said, we don't use nukes because the fear of Russian retaliation. So now I'm going to show we've talked about the war. The invasion all the way down to Busan. Then we push them back to the 38th. Then we push past the 38th to the Yalu. The Chinese get involved. We go down to past the 38th again. Seoul falls back into the communist hands. And then at that point, MacArthur will be removed from office for insubordination. Ridgway takes over. And so for the next 2 years, American troops are slowly going to push back to the 38th. An additional 2 million lives will be lost during that time, right? I mean, I don't know how you don't lay that at MacArthur's feet, right? I mean, you had this war won. You could have stopped at the 38th, liberating the South Koreans, and then every single battle and every single soldier that dies after that was essentially unnecessary. Because by the time that 2 years, when Ridgway gets back to the 38th, that's where we essentially have a truce. The war doesn't end. That won't happen until just recently, as a matter of fact, and we settle in at the 38th, where the war started. And so, all of those extra deaths, looking back on it, it's just like, oh my God, that was unnecessary. So we're going to now go through and I'm going to actually show you the map of how the Korean War played out. So it's not just me talking, you can actually see a visual. So stage one, let's move this out of the way here. Hopefully, all right. Hopefully you guys can see this image now. So stage one, the North Koreans invade, they take Seoul, and they eventually are able to push all the way down past Seoul to Busan. So that's stage two. This is when MacArthur gets involved. He reinforces at Busan and then comes up with the plan to swing around and land troops at Incheon while troops break through at Busan and push up to Seoul. That's the pincer movement that we had talked about. Um, That's the pincer movement that we talked about surrounding the North Korean troops. The North Korean troops are now out of the fight, and then MacArthur crosses the 38th parallel, essentially captures all of North Korea, crosses the Yalu River, and then the Chinese get involved. Once the Chinese get involved, they're able to push all the troops down past the 38th and past Seoul. Ridgway then takes over and is going to slowly push back to the 38th, where we will have a stalemate where the war doesn't technically end, but where we see an end to the fighting. Both sides dig in at the 38th parallel. 38th parallel to this day is one of the deadliest spots on the planet. There are more guns pointed at each other on the 38th parallel than any other spot on the planet. There's more landmines laid in that area. I mean, the 38th parallel is just nutso crazy because the South's afraid that the North is going to invade again. The North is afraid that the South is going to invade, i.e., America is going to invade. And so this is where the war effectually ends. Right? MacArthur, like I said, was removed. This is a big deal. He was removed for disregarding orders of the president. Generals just can't do that. He ordered the troops to advance past the Yalu River. He used American troops north of the 38th parallel. So there's a whole list of things. Truman, a lot of people criticize Truman, like, why didn't you get rid of him sooner? Well, the problem is he was a hero from World War II. For most of this war, Douglas MacArthur was more popular than the president. And so it was very difficult to do. But once all these things lined up, Truman's going to get rid of MacArthur, and the American people are eventually going to buy it because Truman can just say, look at what he did. He met with Shanghai Shek and was like talking about war with China. That would have been World War III. And so when MacArthur's removed from office and he's traveling the country trying to rally support for his political career, all of a sudden now Truman doesn't have to be quiet anymore because MacArthur isn't one of his military subordinates. MacArthur is his political rival, and Truman can just be like, look, I mean, he met with Shek and was like advocating, war with China. Like, you don't want that, Americans. He challenged Truman in public, right? I mean, it just, was meeting with congressmen behind his back, endorsing war with China. And so when Truman exposes all this is just going to end MacArthur's political career and really taint his legacy. I mean, it's, if he would have just stopped at the 38th, he probably would have gone down in history as one of the greatest American generals. I mean, like, up there with Eisenhower and Pershing and a lot of these guys. But unfortunately, now his reputation is tarnished. I say unfortunately, kind of just you made your bed, now you got to lie in it. So, what are the results of the Korean War? Well, one, it's the first military involvement without a declaration of war. That is a pattern we will repeat later. It is an extension of the Truman Doctrine. We do show the world that we will help democracies all around the world from armed invaders. It is going to be the first war sanctioned by the UN. Again, this is significant because it makes the UN a legitimate world body. And it's the first example of a modern limited war. And what I mean by limited war is, World War I and World War II were total wars. So, huge drafts, and, millions of troops. And, the Korean War, 50,000 troops. Most Americans, aren't going to be serving. And if you don't serve, you're not expected to, grow a victory garden. You're not expected to ration food or go on scrap metal drives. The president doesn't outlaw the manufacture of personal vehicles. That's total war, where every aspect of society is geared towards winning the war. The Korean War is not that way. I mean, it's going to affect a lot of American lives. A lot of people are going to know somebody that had to go serve or know somebody that died. I mean, we're going to have, I said 50,000, there's 50,000 casualties. I mean, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of soldiers serve. But 50,000 casualties, very similar to the Vietnam War. So, I mean, it is impactful, but it's not a total war where, a soldier's sister has to go get a job in a factory building tanks. This is not that war. So that concludes our lecture for today. Tomorrow we will pick up with our next Cold War lecture. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it tremendously. See you again soon.